When Private First Class Michael Connors, a 22-year-old medic from Chicago, delivered his first baby in a bombed-out German apartment building on a freezing March night in 1945, the mother refused to look at him for the first 10 minutes after the birth, turning her face to the wall while her newborn daughter cried in his arms. The young German woman, whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front and whose family had fled the advancing Soviet armies, had expected death or brutality from American soldiers, not the gentle competence of a medic who had learned obstetrics from a manual and improvised the rest, while racing against complications that could have killed both mother and child. What shocked her into silence was not just that an American soldier had helped deliver her baby, but that he had treated her with a humanity she had been conditioned to believe enemies did not possess, speaking softly in broken German while working to stop her hemorrhaging, then wrapping the infant in his own clean undershirt when no other cloth was available. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across the American occupation zone in the final months of World War II and the chaotic period that followed, as American medical personnel found themselves delivering babies for women whose nation had just been defeated, navigating a moral landscape where professional duty, human compassion, and military regulations intersected in ways that no training manual had anticipated. The medical crisis that American forces encountered upon entering Germany in early 1945 extended far beyond combat casualties to encompass a civilian population whose healthcare infrastructure had completely collapsed under years of total war. Strategic bombing had destroyed hospitals, clinics, and medical facilities across German cities, while the conscription of German doctors into military service had stripped civilian areas of medical personnel. The situation was particularly desperate for pregnant women who faced childbirth without access to trained midwives, doctors, or even basic sanitary conditions. German medical records from the immediate post-war period document maternal and infant mortality rates that had skyrocketed to levels not seen in Western Europe since the 19th century, with women dying from complications that would have been easily treatable under normal circumstances. The shortage extended to basic supplies, with bandages, antiseptics, anesthetics, and even clean water scarce or unavailable in areas that had been heavily bombed or where infrastructure had been deliberately destroyed during fighting. American military planners had anticipated the need to provide medical care for displaced persons, liberated prisoners, and concentration camp survivors, but the sheer scale of civilian medical need caught occupation authorities unprepared. The non-fraternization policy that governed initial American occupation directives explicitly prohibited American personnel from providing assistance to German civilians beyond what was necessary to prevent disease epidemics that might threaten American forces. This policy reflected the punitive approach that characterized early occupation planning, viewing Germans collectively as responsible for Nazi crimes and therefore undeserving of American aid. For American medical personnel confronting pregnant German women in active labor or experiencing complications, these policy restrictions created impossible ethical dilemmas. Military regulations said to provide no assistance, medical ethics demanded intervention to save lives, and individual conscience often refused to accept that political considerations should determine whether a mother and baby lived or died. The American medics, doctors, and nurses who found themselves delivering babies for German women came from medical backgrounds ranging from fully trained physicians to combat medics whose obstetrical knowledge consisted of a few pages in field manuals and whatever they could remember from high school biology. Captain Robert Morrison, a fully trained obstetrician from Boston who had been drafted into the Army Medical Corps, found himself operating a makeshift maternity ward in a requisitioned German school building in Bavaria, delivering dozens of babies with minimal equipment and assistance from German nurses who spoke no English. Morrison's letters home to his wife, preserved in his family's private collection, describe the surreal experience of practicing obstetrics under conditions that would have been unacceptable in peacetime America, using instruments he had to sterilize, repeatedly because replacements were unavailable, and making medical decisions based on inadequate information because prenatal care had been non-existent for most women. Morrison wrote about the ethical complexity of providing excellent medical care to women whose husbands might have been SS officers or concentration camp guards, struggling to reconcile his professional obligation to treat all patients equally with his horror at what the Nazi regime had done. For medics like Michael Connors, who had received only basic medical training before being thrust into combat, childbirth represented a medical emergency for which they felt profoundly unprepared. Connors kept a journal during his time in Germany, entries from which were later donated to the National World War II Museum, and his accounts reveal the terrifying responsibility of assisting with births when he barely understood the process. His first delivery, the one with the German woman who would not look at him, involved complications that included hemorrhaging, which Connors managed to control through techniques he half remembered from training, applying pressure and elevating. The mother's legs, while desperately hoping that a doctor would arrive before the situation deteriorated further. The doctor never came. Connors managed the emergency on his own, and both mother and child survived. In his journal entry that night, Connors wrote that he had spent the entire war afraid of combat, but nothing had terrified him like the responsibility of holding a human life that had just entered the world while the mother bled beneath his hands, and he prayed that what he was doing was correct. The reactions of German women to receiving medical assistance from American soldiers varied dramatically based on their personal experiences, political beliefs, and the specific circumstances of their encounters with American personnel. Women who had lost family members to Allied bombing or whose husbands had been killed fighting against American forces sometimes refused treatment initially, their grief and anger overriding concerns about medical safety. One particularly striking account comes from a German midwife named Ilse Hartmann, whose personal diary from 1945 describes her interactions with American medical personnel in Frankfurt. Hartmann, who had delivered babies throughout the war years, found herself working alongside an American Army doctor named Captain William Fletcher after the occupation began. Hartmann's diary entries reveal her initial suspicion and hostility toward Fletcher, whom she viewed as part of the force that had destroyed her city and killed her brother. Over weeks of working together, delivering babies in desperate conditions, Hartmann's attitude gradually shifted as she witnessed Fletcher's genuine commitment to saving lives, regardless of nationality. She wrote about feeling ashamed of her initial prejudice when Fletcher worked through the night to save a German woman experiencing severe eclampsia, a dangerous condition that required immediate intervention. Hartmann's diary notes that Fletcher could have simply let the woman die with no consequences, as American personnel were not officially supposed to be providing such extensive care to German civilians, but instead he used scarce American medical supplies and his own expertise to save her life. The linguistic barriers that complicated medical care during childbirth created situations that ranged from merely difficult to potentially dangerous. Most American medical personnel spoke little or no German, while many German women, particularly those from rural areas, knew no English. Communicating during the stress of active labor required improvised sign language, translation by anyone available who spoke both languages, and medical personnel learning to read nonverbal cues that indicated complications. Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez, a medic from Texas whose parents had immigrated from Mexico, found that his Spanish proved unexpectedly useful because several German nurses had studied Romance languages and could communicate better in Spanish than English. Rodriguez's service record includes commendations for delivering more than 30 babies during the occupation period, though he later admitted in oral history interviews that at least half those deliveries involved guessing what the mothers were trying to communicate about pain, contractions, or complications. The potential for dangerous misunderstandings was constant, with medical terminology being particularly difficult to convey across language barriers. Rodriguez described one terrifying situation where he nearly administered a medication the mother was allergic to because neither could understand the other's attempts to communicate. The practical challenges of delivering babies in environments destroyed by war only when a German-speaking American officer and improvisation that would have been unthinkable in normal medical practice. Births took place in basements that served as shelters, in partially destroyed buildings where walls might collapse, in refugee camps where sanitation was almost non-existent, and in makeshift hospitals that had been established in schools or commandeered German facilities. Sterilization of instruments often meant boiling them in water heated over fires made from debris, since electricity and gas service were unreliable or destroyed. American medics learned to deliver babies by flashlight or candlelight when electric lights failed, using their field medical kits and whatever supplies they could scrounge or requisition from military stocks. The shortage of basic supplies meant that items normally considered essential for safe childbirth were often unavailable. Clean sheets, sterile gauze, proper medication, and even sufficient hot water were luxuries that could not be taken for granted. Medical personnel adapted by using materials never intended for obstetrical care, fashioning improvised solutions that prioritized function over ideal medical standards. The psychological dimensions of these medical encounters extended beyond the immediate medical procedure to encompass the broader context of occupation and defeated nationalism. For many German women, accepting help from American soldiers meant confronting the reality that their nation had lost the war and that the enemies they had been taught to fear were showing them more humanity than their own government had provided. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying Americans as brutal barbarians who would rape and murder German civilians, creating expectations of violence that made actual American behavior confusing and psychologically disorienting for some Germans. Women who had believed the propaganda and expected cruelty found themselves receiving competent medical care from soldiers who treated them with professional respect. This cognitive dissonance forced reconsideration of beliefs that had been reinforced through years of propaganda, though the process of adjusting worldviews was neither quick nor universal. Some women responded with gratitude that evolved into friendships despite regulations against fraternization. Others maintained emotional distance, accepting the medical help they needed while refusing personal connection. Still others experienced complicated mixtures of gratitude, resentment, shame, and relief that defied simple categorization. The official American policy evolution regarding assistance to German civilians progressed gradually from the initial strictly non-fraternization directives toward more humanitarian approaches as the reality of occupation became clear. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, initially enforced strict limitations on American aid to Germans, reflecting the punitive mindset that dominated immediate post-war policy. As reports filtered back to military headquarters about the desperate conditions American forces were encountering, including the medical crises facing pregnant women and newborns, pressure grew to modify the policies. By mid-1945, official guidance began allowing American medical personnel to provide emergency medical care to German civilians when life-threatening situations existed, though the definitions of emergency remained vague enough that individual commanders and medical personnel exercised considerable discretion in interpretation. In practice, this meant that American doctors and medics who wanted to help German women during childbirth could generally find justification within regulations, while those who preferred strict adherence to non-fraternization could refuse assistance without facing consequences. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, one of the Army nurses assigned to work with displaced persons in the American occupation zone, kept detailed notes about her experiences that provide insight into how female American medical personnel viewed the situation. Mitchell, who came from a nursing background in obstetrics, found herself delivering babies and providing postpartum care in a refugee camp where conditions were appalling by any medical standard. Her notes describe the particular challenges female medical personnel faced in navigating military hierarchies dominated by male officers while trying to advocate for resources and support for German women's maternal health needs. Mitchell wrote about her frustration with male commanders who viewed childbirth as a minor medical issue compared to combat injuries, failing to understand that maternal mortality could be just as deadly as battlefield wounds. She also described the special connections that sometimes developed between American female personnel and German women, noting that shared experiences of womanhood created bridges across the enemy divide that male personnel often could not establish. Mitchell's observations reveal that gender added another layer of complexity to the already complicated dynamics of providing medical care across enemy lines. The long-term health outcomes for babies delivered by American medical personnel during this period reflected both the dedication of the medical staff and the impossible conditions under which they worked. While many babies survived and thrived despite the challenging circumstances, infant mortality rates remained elevated due to factors beyond what medical intervention could address. Malnutrition among pregnant women meant babies were often born underweight and vulnerable to illness. The lack of proper postnatal care facilities meant that complications arising after birth often went untreated until they became severe. The general breakdown of sanitation and public health infrastructure meant that diseases spread easily among newborns and mothers. American medical personnel did what they could with limited resources, but the scope of need exceeded the capacity to provide comprehensive care. Records from the American military government's Public Health Division document efforts to establish more organized maternal and infant care programs, but these initiatives took months to implement and reached only a fraction of women who needed assistance. The emotional bonds that sometimes formed between American medical personnel and the German families they helped created complicated relationships that defied the official boundaries between occupiers and occupied. Several documented cases exist of American medics or doctors maintaining contact with German families long after the births they had assisted, with correspondence continuing for years or even decades. These relationships reflected the profound intimacy of shared experience during childbirth, a moment of vulnerability and new life that transcended national boundaries and military conflicts. One particularly moving account comes from the family papers of Technical Sergeant David Goldstein, a Jewish-American medic who delivered a baby for a German woman in Stuttgart who had no idea Goldstein was Jewish. Goldstein's letters home to his wife describe the complex emotions of helping bring a German child into the world while knowing that German hands had murdered his relatives in concentration camps. He wrote about wrestling with anger and compassion, about wanting to refuse help but finding himself unable to let a mother and baby die regardless of nationality or recent history. After the war, Goldstein and the German family exchanged Christmas cards for more than 20 years. A connection that Goldstein's family papers indicate brought him both comfort and continued moral complexity about the nature of guilt, innocence, and humanity. The training and expertise that American medical personnel brought to these childbirth situations represented a significant advantage compared to what was available from German medical resources in the immediate post-war period. American military medicine had made substantial advances during the war, with improved understanding of infection control, better surgical techniques, and access to new medications including penicillin that could prevent or treat infections that might otherwise prove fatal. German medical capabilities, while sophisticated before the war, had been degraded by years of conflict, loss of personnel, and destruction of facilities and supplies. American personnel often possessed both better training and better resources than their German counterparts, creating situations where German medical professionals had to overcome pride and nationalism to accept that the enemy could provide superior care. German doctors and midwives who worked alongside American personnel sometimes experienced this as professionally humbling, while others embraced the opportunity to learn newer techniques and gain access to medications unavailable through German channels. The bureaucratic and logistical systems that American forces established to manage public health in occupied Germany gradually expanded to include more organized maternal and infant care, though the transition from chaotic improvisation to systematic programs took considerable time. The American military government's public health branch, established to prevent disease epidemics and manage sanitation, eventually incorporated maternal and child health into its mandate. This expansion reflected recognition that women's health issues could not be separated from broader public health concerns, as maternal and infant mortality contributed to population health crises that threatened stability in occupied zones. By late 1945 and into 1946, American authorities had established networks of clinics where German women could receive prenatal care, childbirth assistance, and postnatal support, staffed by combinations of American personnel and German medical workers, operating under American supervision. These clinics represented a significant improvement over the complete absence of care that had characterized the immediate post-war months, though they still fell short of ideal medical standards due to ongoing shortages and logistical challenges. The moral and ethical questions raised by American medical personnel providing childbirth assistance to German women resonated far beyond the immediate wartime context to influence post-war medical ethics and military medical policies. The experiences challenged assumptions about enemies and innocence, about collective guilt and individual suffering, about the obligations medical professionals owe to all patients, regardless of nationality or recent history. These questions became particularly acute for Jewish American medical personnel, who found themselves providing care to Germans while processing the revelation of the Holocaust and the murder of millions of Jews by the Nazi regime. The psychological burden of reconciling medical duty with rage and grief appears in multiple accounts from Jewish American doctors and medics who struggled to maintain professional objectivity while treating patients whose nation had committed genocide. Some managed this balance by focusing strictly on the medical tasks and viewing patients as individuals separate from collective German guilt. Others found it impossible to separate the individual from the nation and experienced lasting moral injury from providing care they felt was undeserved. The photographic and written documentation of American medical assistance to German women during childbirth remains limited compared to documentation of other aspects of the occupation, partly because such activities were initially not officially sanctioned, and partly because childbirth was considered mundane compared to other dramatic aspects of the post-war period. The photographs and reports that do exist, scattered through various military archives and personal collections, provide glimpses of a humanitarian dimension to the occupation that complicates narratives focused solely on military control and denazification efforts. These images show American medics holding newborn German babies, army nurses instructing German mothers on infant care, and makeshift maternity wards where enemies became patients and soldiers became caregivers. The relative scarcity of such documentation means that this aspect of the occupation remains less well known than it deserves, overshadowed by other elements of the post-war period that received more official attention and systematic recording. The impact on American medical personnel of these childbirth experiences varied widely, with some viewing it as simply part of their medical duties, while others found profound meaning in helping bring new life into a world so recently consumed by death. For combat medics who had spent months or years treating battlefield casualties, the experience of assisting with birth rather than managing trauma represented a psychological counterbalance that some found healing. Staff Sergeant Thomas Chen, whose combat experience included treating wounded soldiers at the Battle of the Bulge, later wrote in his memoir that delivering his first baby in Germany gave him renewed faith in humanity's capacity for hope after months of witnessing death. Chen described holding a newborn German infant minutes after birth and feeling the weight of possibility, understanding that this child would grow up in a world shaped by the war's outcome, but not defined by it. For Chen and others who expressed similar sentiments, participation in childbirth became a form of personal redemption from the trauma of combat, an affirmation that life continued and that their service had meaning beyond destruction. The German women who received medical assistance from American soldiers during childbirth carried these experiences into the post-war period, where memory and gratitude intersected with the complicated process of rebuilding German society and coming to terms with Nazi crimes. Post-war interviews and memoirs from German women who lived through the occupation period occasionally mention American medical assistance with gratitude and recognition that their survival and their children's survival depended on the compassion of former enemies. These accounts contribute to the complex mosaic of German memory about the occupation, which includes both genuine appreciation for American assistance and resentment about the humiliation of defeat and occupation. The children born during this period, delivered by American hands in the chaos of Germany's collapse, became part of the generation that would rebuild their nation and confront its past. Though most would likely never know the specific circumstances of their births or the identity of the American soldiers who first brought them into the world. Looking back at the phenomenon of American Soldiers helping deliver German babies in 1945 reveals something fundamental about the tension between political abstractions and human realities in war and its aftermath. Official policies treating Germans as enemies to be punished could not account for the immediate human need of women in labor, and medical personnel confronted with such needs generally chose compassion over policy compliance. These individual choices accumulated into a humanitarian dimension of the occupation that proceeded alongside and sometimes in contradiction to punitive official approaches. The surprise that German women expressed when American soldiers helped rather than harmed them reflects the power of propaganda on both sides to create expectations that reality then confounded. The Americans were taught to see Germans as enemies deserving punishment. Germans were taught to see Americans as barbaric invaders, and childbirth became one of many contexts where these simplified narratives proved inadequate to explain the complex humanity that emerged when individuals from both sides actually encountered each other. The babies born in ruined cities and refugee camps, delivered by medics who had never imagined such duty, survived to become citizens of a transformed Germany that would eventually become an American ally, a transformation that began in part with individual acts of medical care that acknowledged shared humanity across the divide of recent warfare.